It's 2018. The Chiefs are up by 1 point, and there's only 4 seconds left. The Chargers just scored a touchdown to bring it within 1. They decide to go for 2 here. A risky call, but it works out. A Kansas City player completely abandons their assignment, just a cross-up, which allows the Chargers to pull off this victory. It was one of the coolest moments of that season, as they were able to pull off the upset victory at that time, as they were slight underdogs to the Kansas City Chiefs playing in Kansas City. But was this the correct decision? Now, you might be saying, well, Jackson, that's a pretty stupid question. Of course it was the correct decision. It worked out. God, you are stupid, and your voice is annoying. And to that I say that's a little bit harsh, but I also think that there's more to it than just saying it worked, so therefore it was the correct decision. I mean, to use an obvious example, if it's 1st down and 10, and you elect to punt, and yet when you punt the ball, the opposing team botches the punt and you recover, well then obviously it was not the correct decision to punt on 1st down, but it happened to work out as the opposing team botched the punt and you were able to get the ball further downfield. Of course, you can't be results oriented. Sometimes the decision is correct, sometimes it isn't correct. So when should you go for 2? Well, I'm going to explain basically when you should and when you shouldn't go for 2, and I'm really going to talk about 2 main things. This situation, should you go for 2 when you're down by 1, and then also just should you go for 2 in general. I mean, every single time you score, should you go for 2? It's a strategy often talked about, and so I'm going to get into that as well. Dick Vermeil was one of the first people to create some sort of a cheat sheet, just a straight up list of when he's going to go for it and when he's not, which is just going to help him decide when exactly he should go for it and when he shouldn't, so that way he doesn't have to make any decisions for himself outside of one select situation, and he could just decide what to do. But what's interesting on this list is you notice that if you trail by 1, he says on his list, go for 2. That's what he thinks, but again, this was created in the 70s. We've come a long way in terms of analytics at this point, so going off of this list would not be too smart. So let's go by the numbers, and let's decide if this is the correct decision or the incorrect decision. For one thing, Michael Badgley, the kicker for the Chargers, he was currently 19 for 20 on point after attempts, which is 95%, which is actually, coincidentally enough, almost exactly what the average kicker does on point after attempts. So you have an average kicker, essentially. Heading into this game, the Kansas City Chiefs were 11-2, whereas the Chargers were 10-3, meaning that on a select game, the Chiefs were 7.7% more likely to win, which you could say means that they were 7.7% more likely to win this game if it went to overtime, meaning the Chargers would only have a 46.15% chance to win overtime. Again, that's far from a perfect, solution, but it's kind of the best we have. It's kind of the best general idea you can give for what the best odds are to win in overtime. So essentially, there's a 95% chance it gets to overtime, and then you have a 46% chance, just over 46% chance to win, meaning if you go for 1, you have a 43.8% chance to win if you decide to do that, which is not terrible. I mean, under 50%, but still not a disaster. Now let's go over to should they go for 2. Well, teams the past 2 seasons have actually converted 60% of 2-point conversions, which seems pretty high, and that's because it kind of is. I think that actually I wouldn't say that you have a 60% chance of converting it if you are the average team, because if you're good at converting 2-point attempts, well then you're going to end up trying more, which means you will convert more. So that kind of skews the numbers a little bit. And in fact, if you go back the last 3 seasons, the teams that finished in the middle of the pack, 16th and 17th, each season finished exactly 50%. All 6 of them finished exactly 50%. So to me, the average team converts on 50%. But of course, the Chargers this season were not an average team, they were a pretty good team. Of course, so were the Chiefs. But what's interesting is how these teams got there. Look at this. The Chiefs had the number 1 offense and the number 31 defense. I have it as 32. That's because I'm stupid. Don't ignore that. That's supposed to be 31. Meanwhile, the Chargers, they had the number 11 offense and the number 9 defense. So the Chargers were a very well-rounded team, whereas the Chiefs, they were anything but. They had one of the worst defenses in the league, but one of the best offenses in the league. So given this situation, we know that their odds of converting a 2-point attempt are above 50. We know that for sure. It could be really anything from 51% all the way up to, you could even argue it could be around 80%. personally, for me, I would say it's about a 70% chance in them converting here. I mean, a near top 10 offense going up against one of the worst defenses in the league, there's pretty good odds there, and I think 70% feels about right. So given that their chance to win was just 43.8% if they went for 1, it's clearly the right decision to go for 2, no matter what. Even if it is just 51%, even if it's 50%, there's still better odds. So this was the correct decision, right? Well, in a vacuum, yes, but also there's more to it than that, because actually, if you remember this game, 7 was not the biggest deficit of it. There was actually a bigger deficit. The Chargers were actually down by more than that earlier in the game. With just under 4 minutes left to play, they scored a touchdown, bringing it to an 8-point game, and they had an opportunity to kick an extra point to make it a 7-point game, which they did. However, if they decided to go for 2 here, it would have been incredibly more smart. It would have made way more sense to go for 2 here as opposed to going for 2 the second time. The reason for this is because if you go for it and you don't get it, you have an opportunity to go for it again. And since we've already established that they would have a great chance of converting if they went for it, this means that if they go for it, it gives them a 66.5% chance to win in regulation, meaning they could get it and then also to have to make the extra point at the end of that. So those are 2 things that have to happen, but still a very good chance to win. If not, they can go for it again, and there's a 23.47% chance that they go for it again and make it. In this way, it basically means that they kicked 2 extra points, and all things are equal, it's now going to be overtime. Also, there's a chance that they go for it, don't make it, go for it again, and also don't make it, which means that they lose by 2 points and lose in regulation. There's a 10.05% chance of that happening. But because of all of the things that happened before it, you have now a 10.28% chance of winning in overtime. That's the same expectancy that I said that would happen earlier, meaning that if you decide to go for it on the first one, and we're assuming that you have a 70% chance of converting, that means that you have a 76.78% win expectancy by going for it there. That's crazy high numbers. I mean, you have almost a guaranteed chance, not a guaranteed chance to win, but more than 3/4 of a chance to win, which is very high, especially considering the fact that I'm saying here that if this game goes to overtime, Kansas City has a better chance to win than the Chargers do. But even forget about the Chargers, for example, because 70% chance to convert on a 2-point conversion, I mean, that's a very good odds. Let's just say all things are equal. It's an average team going up against an average defense, so they have a 50-50 shot to convert on a 2-point conversion. Also, both of these 2 teams that are, hypothetical teams, they're both same record and same quality, so 50-50 shot if the game goes to overtime. So if you go for 2 on this first 2-point attempt, you have 2 touchdowns is the idea, and you're going to have 2 extra point attempts. Of course, there's no guarantee you get the second touchdown, but if you don't, your win expectancy is going to be 0 regardless of what you do on the extra point attempts, so it doesn't really matter. But yeah, anyways, you have a 47.7% chance of winning outright, which is you convert on the 2-point conversion on the first one and then kick your extra point on the second one. This also means that you have a 27.3% chance of overtime happening, which is, either you don't convert on the first one and convert on the second one, or do convert on the first one but then miss the extra point on the second one. You also have a 25% chance of just losing outright, but then you have a 13.65% chance of winning the game in overtime, meaning that your win expectancy is 61.35%. Whereas, of course, if you decided to kick the extra point both times, the win expectancy would be slightly below 50% because there's a chance you'd miss the extra point. So in this situation, when you're down 14 points but just score a touchdown, you should almost always go for 2. I created a formula for it, and it looks like this. The X in this is actually times. It's a time symbol. It's not actually X. I know that's a little confusing, but there's no dot on my keyboard. I'm not really sure how to type that. I'm not a mathematician, so I went with the X here. I hope it's not too confusing. But basically, y times 0.95, and that 0.95 can shift depending on how good the kicker is. But you can enter that variable in. That's 9.5, or excuse me, 0.95. And then you add it to y divided by 2. As long as that is greater than z, then you should go for it. And what happens is that y is the chance of converting to 2-point attempt. So let's just say you decide that your chances of converting a 2-point attempt are, I don't know, we'll just make it easy. It's 100%. If it were 100%, then you put 100 for y. Now times it by 0.95, or, take 95% of it, which would make it 95. Then you're going to add it by y divided by 2. So now it's 50, which is 145. So, and if z is 50%, then obviously you should go for it. This is kind of a dumb number to use with 100, but it gets the point across. I didn't really have to create a formula for it, but I wanted to because I wanted to figure out exactly how low can you go, and I figured this out. If you have even odds to win in overtime, going for it down 14 makes sense as long as you have at least a 35% chance of converting it. That low. You just need a 35% chance if you have even odds in overtime. And the reality is that if you don't have if you don't have a 35% chance of converting it, there's no way you have even odds of winning in overtime. I mean, the real way that it would make sense to not go for it in this situation, the only way I can really think of would be if you have like the number 1 defense and like the number 31 offense, and then your opponent has like the number 32 offense and like the number 2 defense. Like, it would have to be that extreme for you to not go for it here in this situation. So yeah, in a vacuum, that was the correct decision to go for 2 to try to win it. However, looking back on it a little bit, probably should have gone for 2 earlier. But at the end of the day, if we're just talking about the one scenario, when you're down by 1, should you go for 2? In that situation, the answer is yes. And while when you're down 14 and have just scored a touchdown, you should almost always go for 2, it's not quite that dramatic when it comes down to when you're down by 1, should you go for 2. Like on this play, this is a great example where it was the Panthers going up against the Lions. Cam Newton's going to take the snap, and they're going to try and see if they can win it right here. It's a very similar situation. A player does get open, but Newton just completely misses the throw, and it falls incomplete, and the Lions are able to win. So it didn't work out. But as I've explained before, you can obviously make the correct decision and have it not work out. If you had a 90% chance of converting there and it missed, well, that was still the correct decision. But for Carolina, this was not the correct decision on this play. They should not have gone for 2 here. They should have kicked the extra point and played for overtime. The reason for this is because of how much better of a team Carolina was than Detroit. I mean, Carolina was 6-3 heading into this game, whereas the Lions were 3-6. I mean, these are clearly 2 different teams on 2 different wavelengths, and the Panthers have kind of gotten unlucky to still be in a position to lose this game at this point. Now, one of the arguments against going for it here might be because Graham Gano hasn't been great this season. He's just 24 for 26 on extra points, which is 92%, so that's definitely on the lower side. But Carolina would still have a 61.36% chance to win if they just kick the extra point here. What's really interesting here is that when it came down to the Panthers offense and the Lions defense, they both were 10th best. So, there's really no clear advantage on either side here. You basically have a 50-50 shot. It's a flip of a coin. Although the Panthers defense was significantly better than the Lions offense that year. So what does this mean? Well, it means that if you decided to just kick the field goal and go for overtime, you had a 61.36% chance to win. And again, you could argue that's a little bit high. I mean, I'd use the same math I used for the Chiefs Chargers thing. I get it. It could be considered a little bit high. But either way, the reality is that if you went for 2, you only have a 50% chance to win. So there's definitely a better than 50% chance Carolina would have won had they kicked the extra point. But going for 2, it was just 50-50, flip up a coin. I mean, the Panthers offense was just as good as the Lions defense that year, so there was no clear advantage. So it really comes down to, it depends. I mean, it's those 2 key factors that I would really say when it comes down to should you go for 2 or not. It's how good is your team compared to their team, and how good of a chance do you have to win in overtime, and then also how good of a chance do you have to convert on a 2-point conversion. I mean, it's really kind of that simple. There's other factors in it too, like, rest is a factor. Hey, if there's virtually no difference, then maybe you should just try to win it now so your players aren't more tired for next week. Although the reality is a win is so important that to me it's just not necessarily worth it to risk that. I think literally unless you can't make a decision about which one you think you have a better chance on, I think you should always just not even focus on that. Also, I'm sure some of you are probably screaming at the video right now, or have maybe even put it in the comments already saying you forgot about ties. I didn't forget about ties. It just makes the math easier to not talk about ties, so I decided to skip that for a second. But I do also want to bring up that a tie is not a bad thing necessarily. I mean, a tie, if there's a tie, I mean, it's basically means that you get a win, but you lose all tiebreakers. That's what it virtually means. Because if you were a 9-7 team, but then you can flip one of your losses to be 9-6, this now means that all 10-6 teams are clearly ahead of you, but all 9-6 teams are not, and typically that's enough to get into the playoffs, and you don't need that tiebreaker too often. Typically a 10-6 record or a 9-6-1 record will get you wins. So a tie is actually a lot better than people realize. So that's the first part of this video. That's the first thing I wanted to touch on. But there's a second part too, and it's something that I've heard get talked about a lot, and I kind of wanted to figure for myself out if this is true or not, which is, should you just always go for 2? Should you just every time go for 2? And there's some pretty, damning numbers that can go right into it. Like, look at this. So in 2019, there was 1,332 total touchdowns, which translates to roughly 42 touchdowns a year per team. And because the average team only has a 95% chance of kicking your extra point, this now means that you're, on average, only going to get 39.9 points from going for 1 in the point after attempts. Whereas if you decide to go for 2 and you do it at a 50% rate, you'll get 42 points for it. And if you're one of the better teams that can get it up to 60%, well, then you're going to get 50.4 points per game, which is, definitely significant, right? I mean, you're gaining an extra 10 points per game. Even if you're just an average team, you're still gaining an extra couple points per season, not per game. But still, a couple extra points per season, nothing dramatic, but it's a slight upgrade, right? Well, not exactly. Because the point of football is not to score as many points throughout the course of a season. And you might be saying, what on earth are you talking about? Of course it's a great thing to score more points throughout the course of the season. You really are a stupid idiot, and your voice hasn't gotten any better. When are you going to change your voice, you stupid idiot? But just hear me out. I mean, there are obvious situations where you shouldn't go for 2. I mean, for example, if you are currently tied, but you score a touchdown with about 2 minutes left, so you're up 6. Well, if you went for 2 here, it would just be a dumb idea. Because assuming your opponent also scores a touchdown, which again, if they don't, nothing matters. Assuming they score a touchdown, it would mean that if you go for 2 and they also score a touchdown later, then you would have a 25% chance of winning outright, which would be you convert your 2-point attempt, they do not. 25% chance of overtime, which is you convert your 2-point attempt and so do they. And there would be a 50% chance of a loss in regulation. It's actually a little bit less than 50% because there's a chance of a missed extra point, but it's essentially 50%. And that would, of course, be if you go for 2 and don't get it, then your opponent, all they would have to do is kick the extra point because they would see that that's going on. So, while yes, you would be more likely to score more points over the course of a season by going for 2 in this manner, it would not be very smart. But I think a lot of people, some people might say, well, there you go. That's why you don't go for 2 every time. Because in the first quarter, if you score a touchdown and you go for 2, well, then your opponent will just go for 2 right back. But the reality is, we all know that wouldn't really happen necessarily. A lot of coaches are set in their ways, and if they saw another guy going for 2, they'd probably just say, okay, he's crazy, well, I'll still go for the 1. So they probably wouldn't do that early on in the game, but they might later on in the game if they had to. So while it would be a lot easier to just pretend like that was the case and call it a day, that's not really the case. So I decided to, do some math here. So in the average game, there's 5.2 touchdowns per game, and there's 46.7 points per game. So 2 of the more common scores would be 24-24 or 20-20 in terms of scores that end in ties. And this is all very important, but just bear with me. So the first things first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go with a score of 20-20. At least that's what it would be. So essentially, each team scores 2 touchdowns and 2 field goals. But we'll change it where one of the teams is now going for 2 every time, Team A, they're going for 2 every time, whereas Team B, they're going to continue doing what they typically do and go for 1 every time. We're also going to assume here that Team B has kind of the classic head coach who is kind of set in their ways, and they probably won't just immediately shift if they see another team going for 2. In fact, they probably wouldn't start going for 2 unless they had to, unless it was the 4th quarter. So I went back and calculated all the touchdowns that were scored in the 4th quarter, and you have a 28% chance, if it's a touchdown, of it being in the 4th quarter. And so really, if you think about it, there are 4 options. There's you go for 1 and you just win 50% of the time. This is in a 2020 scenario because then it's going to go to overtime and you will miss the extra point just as much as the opposing team will miss the extra point because we're assuming everything is equal in this scenario. So that one's obvious, but then there's 3 more options. You could go for 2 and they don't get a single touchdown in the 4th quarter. You go for 2 and they only get 1 of their touchdowns in the 4th quarter. Or you could go for 2 and they get both of their touchdowns in the 4th quarter. Again, they scored 2 touchdowns and 2 field goals just like you did. So due to probabilities, the chances are that they didn't score any of their touchdowns in the 4th quarter, over a 50% chance. There's about a 40% chance that they got 1 of them, and then there's under an 8% chance that they got both of their touchdowns in the 4th quarter. And what's also interesting here is the expectancy of winning that you have for each of these groups, where if you go for 2 and they don't get a single 4th quarter touchdown, then your expectancy to win is about 53.12%. This is because there is a better chance of you scoring more points throughout the course of this game by going for 2 than by them going for 1. Because yes, you pretty much have a 50-50 shot each time, and the odds are the majority of these times you're still going to end up with 20 points, but there's going to be a few enough times where your opposing team misses that extra point, their own extra point, which now means that you will win a few amount of these games by 22-19. If one of their touchdowns is in the 4th quarter, and again, I keep saying in the 4th quarter, I mean, you could easily just phrase it as if they score a touchdown after you score a touchdown, but I think the 4th quarter thing kind of works just simply because I think it's just a good number to use if of a 4th quarter touchdown. Because yes, a team might decide to react in the 3rd quarter, and teams might not decide to react early on in the 4th quarter. But I think that this is about accurate. Again, not a perfect science, but I think it's as close as you can probably get to it. So basically, if one of their touchdowns is in this situation and they decide to react to it, there's a 25% chance that you will convert both of your 2-point conversions, meaning that even if they decided that they wanted to react to it, they wouldn't be able to. You would have 22 points, and they would, after scoring their conversion, they would just be at 21 if they decided to go for 2, so they wouldn't go for 2 and it wouldn't matter. Also, what the biggest odds are of happening is that you would convert on one of your 2-point attempts but not on your other one, meaning that your opposing team would still just kick the extra point and there's a 50-50 shot in overtime. So that's the other big opportunity. And the other opportunity would just be that both of your attempts failed, which means that you just automatically lose. They kick the extra point and you lose. So in this scenario, it would just be a 50-50 shot. Finally, what would happen if Team B reacted to both of the opposing touchdowns? Team A scored them both first, and now Team B is reacting to both. If Team A were to be successful on both of their 2-point attempts, this would now mean that Team B would just have a 3.12% chance of winning because they would have to go for it both times and then convert it both times and still win in overtime. So a lot that would have to happen. But at the same time, it does give you a slightly better advantage. I mean, if you compare that to the first 2 scenarios, if they went for 2 both times, this now means that you would just lose. So it's definitely better than that. There's also still, again, the most likely scenario is that you make one and miss one. And if you do that, it again means overtime. So once again, everything is the same. And of course, the other option is that there's, a chance that both of Team A's attempts just missed, which would mean now Team B, they have a much better chance to win. So it's very similar to the one I showed you earlier, but this time what's going to happen is that you see how both of those 2 numbers, the 1 and the 3rd, are the same statistic. Well, they're the same, but they're for two different teams. The first one would be Team A's percentage of winning. The third one is Team B's percentage of winning. So, in a vacuum, you could sit here and say, well, hey, out of any of these scenarios, it's completely even. But when you add on to the fact that teams probably wouldn't react, it now means that, there's only a 7.8% chance that the scenario where Team B would be favored would happen, meaning that there is a much stronger chance that Team A would win. And in this situation, if you go for 2 always, you would win 52% of the time using my arbitrary method of figuring out how opposing teams would react to it. However, that's just one part of it. I mean, that's just one scenario. There's another scenario that's similar, which is also overtime, and this is the other score I talked about, 24-24. So now there's an odd number of touchdowns each team scored, which might seem like it means absolutely nothing, but it actually means a ton, and you'll see why. So first, these are the percentages that could happen. The most likely thing to happen this time is that there is 1 fourth quarter touchdown, then the next highest is no fourth quarter touchdowns, and then, 2, and then obviously 3 has a very small percentage chance of happening. But think about the scenario where there's no fourth quarter touchdown. This time, unlike last time, basically what's going to happen is that it's going to all come down to if the opposing team makes or misses their 2 out of 3 attempts at the 2-point conversion. If they make 2, they'll probably win. If they miss 2, they'll probably lose, assuming both teams score the same amount of touchdowns or field goals. It's virtually a 50% chance. Meanwhile, if Team B were to just have 1 or 2 of their touchdowns come at a point where they could react to it, this now means that for Team A, their chance of winning comes below 50%. And the reason for that, of course, is you can react to it a little bit, where if Team A were to have converted 2 out of the 3 of their conversion attempts, this now means that Team B would still have an opportunity to also convert on one of theirs, and then it would force overtime. Again, it's not a crazy scenario. It only gives them 0.1% of a chance, but a slight difference. And then if they had all 3, this actually gives them a much bigger chance to potentially win Team B does. Because again, just think about the options. Team A, they either miss all 3, in which case it's easy, or they miss 2 out of 3, which is still easy. All Team B has to do is, kick a couple extra points, and they could even miss 1 and still be alright in that scenario, if they missed all 3. And then if Team A were to make 2 out of 3, well then Team B could potentially convert and tie the game and force overtime. And even if Team A went out and made all 3, well then Team B could decide to go for it on all 3 and potentially tie that up. So there's no guaranteed win this time. So if they can, again, if they can control how much they can react to, it can be a very good thing. Meaning when you go for 2 and you had an odd number of touchdowns, you only win 49.96% of the time. Again, keep in mind, while there is one dramatic shift, in that dramatic shift, it's only a 2.23% chance of happening, and there is a big chunk of the 37.3 that's a 50% chance. So there's virtually no difference actually if you go for 2 in this situation of odd, but you do technically lose a little bit of a percent chance of winning, and it's definitely not as good as if there's an even number. So those are the 2 most common ways that going for 2 every time would actually come into effect, but there's a couple other ways that could happen. I mean, for one thing, there's just the obvious one, where like, hey, if your opponent, Team B, scores 19 points, well, if you kicked a field goal and scored 2 touchdowns, but you didn't go for 2, you would have only had 17. But if you went for 2 both times, maybe you could have had 19, and then potentially could have won the game in overtime. However, in that scenario, it doesn't actually help you that much, because there's just as high likelihood of it happening in the reverse way as well. Where in this scenario, Team B scores, let's say, 15 points, and you kick a field goal and score 2 touchdowns, but because you missed both 2-point conversions, this now means that the score is 15-15, and now your opponent has a chance to win in overtime. So it can work both ways, and the way I've looked at the numbers, I don't really see a clear advantage one side or the other, so I'm not really taking that into account. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other ways that going for 2 every time can impact the game in a positive way. I mean, this is actually probably the most positive way it can work. What you see on the screen is 3 different scenarios, 1, 2, and 3. And these are scenarios where your opposing team could have potentially lost, because they missed extra points, whereas you went for 2, let's say 2 times, and made 1 and missed the other. The 1 on the screen is for if you lost by 1 point, the 2 is if you lost by 2 points, and the 3 is if you lost by 3 points, and had you gone for 2 every time, then you had slightly better odds of actually winning in each of these scenarios, although in certain scenarios it's certainly very slightly. So let's start with number 3, and the way that this works is that, let's just say the score was 38-35, that was the final score. You went for 2 every time, except for 1, we'll say, which is how you got 35, whereas they just kicked an extra point every time. Now, there would have been a small chance for them to fail, because if they missed the extra point 3 times, well, then it would have been a tie game, and maybe you could have won in overtime. Of course, the chances of that happening are next to 0 and not really worth talking about. There's slightly better odds of a team missing 2 extra points in a single game when you're down by 2, which can allow you to then bring up, and tie the game, but that's not very high either. But there's actually a pretty decent amount of odds of a team missing 1 extra point in a single game. It's actually not that uncommon. I haven't explained what the difference is between the numbers on the in the middle and on the right are, and that's because the ones on the right would be what were the odds of something actually changing in the game had there only been 2 field goal attempts, or 2 extra point attempts, whereas the ones on the left are, the difference is 3. So basically 3 extra point attempts on the left, 2 extra point attempts on the right. That's the difference between those two. That's why in row 3, there is a 100% chance that things would have stayed the same if you only had 2 point after attempts and there was a 3-point difference, although I didn't really take those actual scenarios into account. But the reason why I chose 2 or 3 is because, if you remember, the average team scores about 2.5 touchdowns in a game, so I figured I will, do both of them here. But clearly, now that you know what these numbers mean, there's the one number that sort of, jumps out at you a little bit, and it's the 85.7375. Because if there's 3 point after attempts, again, we'll use another example. Let's just say the final score ended up being 21-20. That was the final score, where Team A went for 2 both times they scored a touchdown, made 1, missed the other, and then they kicked 2 field goals and got 20 points. Whereas Team B, they made a touchdown all 3 times, but there was only an 85% chance that they would have made all 3 extra points. There's a very real chance they would have missed one, and it would have gone to overtime. And not only that, but they could have missed multiple, which could have lost it in regulation. And even if they only had 2 touchdowns, there's still only just over a 90% chance that they make both of them. Of course, the odds of this happening are incredibly small, but at the end of the day, there still is a chance, and you only win 50% of the overtime games that you're in. But even with that, you have a slightly better odd if you do this in this select situation. If you were going for 2 in this certain situation, you would have had a 51.6% chance to win those games. Again, not exactly, overwhelming, but in this situation, it would have mattered to some degree. There's also one other key situation, and I know I'm going on for a long time now. I'm starting to wonder if anyone's even watching this video. Hopefully somebody's hanging around because I'm having fun with it. But this is the other situation. The other situation, it can be easily explained in this scenario where Team A scores a touchdown, another touchdown, and then a field goal, whereas Team B ends up scoring 1 touchdown and 3 field goals. So Team A, 2 touchdowns and a field goal. Team B, 3 field goals and a touchdown. So if all things held the same, it would be a 17-16 game, and that would be the end of it. But this time, the team that needs to react is not the team that is going out and, trying to just kick extra points. It's a team that is going for 2 here. So it's, Team A that has to react in this scenario, meaning that basically, the reason for it, of course, is that if you're going to win by 1 like this, you wouldn't go for 2. But if both of your touchdowns came in the first quarter, well, then you might go for 2. So basically, there's a 51.8% chance that they don't get a fourth quarter touchdown. Both of their touchdowns come before they can react, which would still give them a 50% chance of winning. So even if you don't get a fourth quarter touchdown, you still have a 75% chance of winning this game, which, it sounds incredibly high. Keep in mind, this is a scenario where typically you do win. You score 2 touchdowns and a field goal compared to 3 field goals and a touchdown, typically there is a 1-point victory there. But now you only have a 75% chance of winning as opposed to a much higher percent chance. It's the same thing if you get one opportunity. It's virtually the same thing because, again, you can figure out that math pretty easily. And then the third option is going to be if your opponent gets 2 fourth quarter touchdowns. The third option, of course, is the best one, which means that all you have to do is make your 2 extra points and you'll win because you know what the score is at this point. You know that making both your extra points will win the game for you, so you're not too concerned about going for 2, meaning you have a 90% chance to win. So this is pretty good. So if you're going for 2 every time and this scenario plays out, you have a 76% chance of winning. However, if you were going for 1 every time, you would have a 90.25% chance of winning. The reason this scenario is unique is because your opponent scored 2 field goals, and you took the lead by scoring a touchdown and getting the extra point. But if you go for 2, you have a much less high chance of just converting than if you go for 1, which is, it's just the one situation where it's a really bad idea to be trying to go for 2 every time, and of course, it's pretty much impossible to predict unless you've already seen this scenario play out, so that's why the fourth quarter touchdown rule still applies here. So I had to sit here and decide what's the better option. I have the numbers in front of me. I wanted to figure it out. So first, I went back and looked at every season. Not every season, that would be a lot of work. I looked at every game from last season, and I figured out each game that has this certain scenario that has come through. So overtimes with even touchdowns, overtimes with odd touchdowns, the field goal situation that I just talked about where 7 is greater than 6, that unique thing, and then the missed point after attempt, that's the one I talked about just before. So as you see, there was a far more amount of games that could have been potentially impacted through the missed point after attempt than any of these other situations. And as a whole, there's a lot of regular games. I mean, the games that would not have been decided one way or the other if one of the teams went for 2 every time were, trumps all of them. There's 209 games that had nothing to do with these. So definitely a lot more of those. And so I just decided to calculate everything. For a normal game, you have a 50% chance to win. And then for each other scenario, I just calculated what's your odds of winning for each of those games, put them all together, and figured out which scenario do you have the best opportunity to win the most amount of games. If you go for 2 every time, or if you go for 1 every time. And so I calculated it all together, and it was even more difficult and even more complicated because doing the field goal things, there's 2 different scenarios, so I had to split the 5 games in half and just multiply it that way. So even more math than I wanted to do. But after figuring it out, I came to the conclusion that if you decide to go for it every single time in the 2020 season, your win expectancy is 50.1%, which is just the most hilarious number that I think I could have come up with, because yes, it ends up being that, okay, it is technically worth it, but also it's literally 0.1% worth it, so it's that small. Yeah, I think this might have been a complete waste of time. I think that's what I've come to the realization. I don't know if anybody watched this, to be honest. I feel like everyone is tapped out at this point. Nobody is still here. It seemed like a good idea in my head, but the more and more I tried to figure this out, I realized how much more math it's going to be. I even guessed on some stuff and, tried to hurry some stuff. But this has just been a complete... I've slowly gone insane throughout the course of making this video. I hope somebody enjoyed this. I think it's interesting, though. I think that I've got some interesting stuff here. I found out that it is probably worth it to go for it every time. Although also, now that I'm thinking about it, the difference is so small, you could easily make the argument that because if you now go for it every time, you have to draw up more 2-point conversion plays, meaning you would have slightly less likely of a chance to convert every time, meaning that we still don't know. I still feel like we've accomplished nothing here, so I don't know. I feel like this is a big waste of time. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Someone had to have enjoyed it, I hope. But anyways, thanks for watching. And I already said, of course, let me know in the comments below, what were your thoughts on this video? If you made it to the end, did anyone make it to the end? I'm genuinely curious if anyone somehow plowed through this whole video. I hope it was interesting. I don't know. Anyways, thanks for watching.